Happy Tuesday. I want to share something really, really good to know. And if you're like me, maybe these terms have thrown you off. You didn't quite understand them at first. But one is the fear of the Lord, and the other one is the joy of the Lord. And my question to this is, we know fear to be something in this world to be like, oh, trembling, scared. You don't want to go near it, But the Bible talks about the fear of the Lord many times. And it also talks about the joy of the Lord. So here's the question. Can you have fear of the Lord and have joy at the Lord at the same time? How do you do that? What does that look like? I want to share an account. I always like to point to a biblical account, something that really happened in history that can portray this. Okay, in the book of Joshua, specifically in chapter 9, God gave Joshua the charge and the rule to take over from Moses and get the children to the promised land. And when they cross, when they're crossing the river, they have many lands, all these inhabitants of the land, the wicked people, wicked kingdoms, if you will, that God says, I will deliver them into your hands, and you will possess the land. This is God's promise through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So anyways, Joshua's leading them, and this is where we're going to pick up right here. There's something I want you to learn here. So they're coming up in chapter 9 of Joshua. They're coming up. They just got done destroying a kingdom of Ai. They destroyed a kingdom of Sihon. They destroyed a bunch of kings, and God was delivering them wicked people into their hands and destroying them all. Well, anyways, you get to Joshua 9, and it says this. But when the inhabitants, these are people that are in the land that's supposed to be destroyed. It says, but when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, it says they worked craftily, and they went and pretended to be ambassadors. And it says they took old sacks on their donkeys. They took wineskins. They were torn and mended. They took old and patched sandals on their feet. Old garments on themselves, and bread of their provision was dry and moldy. So these people heard about the children of God, the children of Israel. They heard about them and what God's been doing with them, and they worked fast to change up their attire here. And I want to flash forward this Gibeon, what they do. So they dress themselves up. In verse 6 it says, and they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, and they said to him, we have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us. So these guys were scared. They heard what God has been doing with them, and they quickly crafted something up. They said, let's make a covenant. Let's get them to make a covenant with us. So anyways, long story short, Joshua did that very thing. Joshua asked them, they said, who are you and where you come from? And they said, we came from a far country. Really, they didn't. They just dressed up and acted like they were poor, long travelers. And they said, but they said something true here in verse 9. They said, because of the name of the Lord your God, we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt. So these guys heard about what God's been doing with his children and what he was doing in the past. And they tricked Joshua to making a covenant with them, which Joshua did. It said that they didn't seek the counsel of the Lord, so they went ahead and made a covenant with these guys. And God knew it. God knew from the beginning to the end. He knows all things. So what they did was they had a fear of the Lord, and they quickly made something go together. And then Joshua found out. He found out that it was they tricked him, and so anyways, let's see here. Joshua said, "Why have you deceived us, saying that you were from a very far country?" Because he found out they were not from a far country. As a matter of fact, they were from the land they were supposed to destroy. So Joshua's like, "Why did you deceive us?" Here's their answer in verse 23. Joshua told them. Gibeon told Joshua. He said, "Because your servants were clearly told that the Lord, your God, commanded his servant Moses to give you all this land and to destroy all the inhabitants." So they heard about this thing going on. And he said, of the land that we're from, it says from before us, it says, and we were very much afraid for our lives because of you. We were very much afraid of our lives because of you and what God's been doing. And we did this thing. Anyways, Joshua said, now therefore, you are accursed, and none of you shall be freed from being slaves. So basically, you're going to be slaves. He said, you're going to be woodcutters and water carriers for the house of God. Okay, so now here's this curse that Joshua's proclaiming, and they're taking it well. And anyways, they went on verse 25. They said, hey, they said, now do with us as it seems good and right to do. They don't mind. They just don't want to be on the wrong side of God's wrath. They feared God because they heard what he's done, and they disguised themselves. They made a covenant, and this is how it happened. God honored this covenant because God knew their hearts. God created them. Just like he created Israel, he created them, and he wanted them to be saved. Just like all flesh, God doesn't desire that any should perish. So anyways, this Gibeon had the fear of the Lord, and they did what they did, and they made a covenant. Okay, Proverbs 9:10 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Guess what? Gibeon feared the Lord, and they chose to do something different, and not just try to fight these guys, but not to go against God's plan, but to actually go into God's plan. Proverbs 19:23 says the fear of the Lord leads to life. Guess what? Because they feared the Lord, they understood who God is. They understood that God created all things. They understood that this is God's plan. These are God's chosen nation that he chose to go through. And they said, we're gonna get ourselves grafted into this. We're gonna get covenanted into this. So that's what they did. And I want to share some verses. Well, oh, by the way, Gibeon was actually known to be one of the greater cities. They were one of the mightier. It says all of their men were mighty. They weren't just pilgrims. These were mighty men that were established, and they had wisdom enough to say, this is a God that we do not want to go against. This is a God that we want to be with. So they chose to graft themselves into Israel with a covenant that was made. So I want to share some things right here. Psalm 84. So remember, Gibeon said, you're going to be woodcutters and water carriers. That's going to be your curse. Slaves. Guess what? Psalm 84 verse 10 says, a day in the Lord's courts is better than 1,000. He says, I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. Guess what? Gibeon understood that God was coming in to clear things out. And they said, we need to get this figured out, what we want to do. Are we with God or are we against God? They went with God. So they were happy to be woodcutters and water carriers for the Lord, and instead of being in the tents of wickedness, who the Lord's going to consume with fire. So this is my point to this. I want to point to number one: Israel is God's chosen people. The church did not replace Israel. We were grafted in. Ephesians talks about how we were grafted into the commonwealth of Israel. So don't mistake that. But most importantly, I want to point this out, that Jesus created you. If you don't know Jesus today, he is the only way. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of life. So to fear the Lord is to say, I acknowledge that this is temporary. I acknowledge that there's judgment after life because of sin that we're all born into. But Jesus came so that we could enter into him and be saved, and we can have a new life right now. Be born again. God gives you his own spirit. And then he gives you a promise of eternal life. That's an awesome thing. It says Colossians 1, verse 17. 16 says all things were created through Jesus and for him. He loves you and he don't want you to die. So now the joy of the Lord. Nehemiah says the joy of the Lord is your strength. If you're a Christian, you have strength that is from the joy of the Lord. I told my kids, imagine as if your heart has a cup, a joy cup. That joy cup can only be filled by the joy of the Lord. And that joy of the Lord is your strength, okay? And now you can get vacation or candy and presents, and you get joy from that, but that is not the joy of the Lord. That will not give you strength that the joy of the Lord will. Well, the joy of the Lord comes from knowing who God is and what he says. Jesus says this. He said, just as as the Father loves me and I love you, abide in my love. He said, abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. He said, just as I kept my Father's commandments. He said, these things I speak to you so that so my joy may remain in you and your joy may be full. He said this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. The love of God passes. It's an awesome thing. It's above all love. There's no love outside of God. It's unconditional. And he loves you, and he wants you to know his love, but you have to receive him. You have to say, Lord, I understand that this is a serious matter, that if I die without Christ, there's judgment to pay. I have a fear in me now. I want to seek the Lord out with my whole heart. He'll reveal himself to you when you do that. So God bless you guys. I got to go back to work. I hope you have this well. Take this well. Be like Gibeon and say, we're gonna graft ourselves into this covenant. You get grafted in through the blood of Jesus. That is the new covenant. That is through the new covenant. And if you're a believer, or if you're not a believer, you can say, Jesus, I want to know you today. I want to give my whole life to you and surrender it to you. I want to live for you, to know you. God will save you. He wants you to know him. God bless you guys.